Okay, we are recording. So this is the second happy hour, which is the craft workshop. And I am Eileen Cook. I am the author of 15 different novels, and it's my job to sort of help you navigate the craft questions that you might have. So I have some things to talk about, but we also have Christy here today. Hello, Christy.
Hello.
And I always want to open if there's anything that you're working on in particular that you had a question with.
Yes, in particular, I was actually reading your sort of procrastinators list of things, which I found very useful. I would encourage everyone to go and read that. And not that I'm procrastinating, but I'm finding right now that I'm kind of off track in terms of where I thought my protagonist was going to go, but I've been taking your advice and just kind of letting stuff be written.
Yeah.
And so now he's going quite off track. What do you do when that happens?
When
and
they wander?
How much do you listen to that darn protagonist?
So first a question. Why do you think your character is wandering? Do you think the path you set out isn't of interest to him? Like if he was a person and you were his counselor and he had come to you and said, I want to accomplish this thing, and then he went off and started doing this other thing, why do you think he's doing that?
Interesting. Okay, that's a really good question. I was sort of looking at more narcissistic approach as the writer, thinking, okay, I think it's a valuable exercise to just explore some of the other things that perhaps he's thinking about, but they may not end up in the story. So I'm sort of thinking it's kind of backstory that he's telling me. But
hang on, I'm getting a message.
Yeah.
I think it's an old one. Did you try and click in earlier?
No.
So for those people on the recording, we're just making sure that no one is missing who is desperately trying to find us in Zoom, but I don't see them. Oh, sending one more message. I can't multitask. So two parts. So going back to what you're saying, so you have a character that kind of goes off. So one, I think there's a real value in actually sometimes letting them go off because you're finding out more about them. I'm going to do a masterclass in February on character backstory.
Okay.
And I think it's important for two reasons. One, because I recently did an edit project where the person was struggling in terms of having quite a lot of backstory and trying to say, like, I know all of this is important and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, but it was slowing her story up, which is the problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we had to talk about, like, why do we want to know backstory? And I think the biggest part of it has to do with who we are in the past impacts what changes we make now. So for example, if you've been really horribly hurt in a past relationship and you now meet somebody new and there's, some romantic feelings, as you become closer, you may react in a different way than someone who had a past where things were going really well. Mm-hmm. So as a writer, you have a thing you want the character to do. Like you, by gosh, have a journey for them. We're going from A to B to C, and we're going to end up here at Z. And sometimes we are trying to force the character to follow that path, but we may not know why they would follow it. Mm-hmm. So what is it? Motivation to some degree, but also what is that stuff in their past? So sometimes writing those scenes, even if you end up tossing them out, gives you a much clearer idea about what's happened for them, what's going on for them, how they might be reacting in different situations that then become important to the main thing. So that is sometimes a really good value.
Okay.
But that's not your only option. Your second option is, are you an outliner? I can't remember.
No.
Okay.
Now, as you know, though, with this particular project, it started as a screenplay quite a few years ago. So in a way, I feel like I have much more of an outline than I would ever have normally done.
Yeah.
But I'm finding that the story that I thought I had is now quite different than what it was, when I started it.
And that can also be off track because it is quite possible that your story has actually changed. So as someone who is an outliner, and we had an interesting conversation last happy hour about plotters versus pansters, and the benefits and pros and cons to each of those. But certainly, if you are a plotter or you are the kind of person who does an outline, one of the challenges is understanding that is nothing more than a rough guideline.
Right. Okay.
I would akin it to, when you travel. So, funny story. When I traveled with my dad growing up, my dad is the ultimate planner. He's not a writer at all. He's an accountant. But if he was a writer, he would be the writer who had a 500-page outline. So I can remember specifically, we went to England when I was, I think, 12. And we had an itinerary for every day. So down to we're up at 7, we're going to have breakfast by 7:30. We're going to go to this particular tube stop. We're going to, do this kind of thing. And then we will do this. And I can remember we were at some museum, and I can't remember what it was anymore, but we were not having fun. Do you know what I mean? Nobody was enjoying this particular process. And it came up, well, we could go, we were on vacation, we could leave. And my dad said very distinctly, we are here until 2:00. As if there was some sort of,
it was written in stone.
Yeah, some Bantam Death March. And I can remember being other places where we were having an amazing time. Oh my, look at that. It would be okay, schedule's on, we got to get the next thing. Versus feeling that it would have been okay or acceptable just to hang out there. And writing can be a bit that way when you have an outline. You have an outline depending how much time or thought you've put into that. You kind of want to keep the characters on that, but then you find I'm not having as much fun in this museum as I thought I was, or I'm having more fun over there, but that's not where I'm supposed to be spending my time. Maybe I should be going back over to this other place.
Right.
So the first thing is, am I writing stuff that I just need to write to find my story? The second thing is it possible that we're off track because the characters actually know better where we're supposed to be going, which is possible.
Yeah.
Those, I think, are the two primary. I do think there is sometimes a procrastination thing that takes place, but I usually see that more with research. Where people are I can't write this until I understand day by day what happened in the Napoleonic War, because my character has one scene where there's a battle, and so I have to have that completely understood before I can move forward. And that becomes kind of a way of getting off track. Usually if you're writing, I don't tend to think of it as procrastination. I tend to think of it as something your brain is trying to figure out about the story.
Okay. That gives me some heart anyway. So I sometimes feel right now that I'm happy that I'm writing more, not as much as I would like.
Yeah.
But I feel like some of it is whoa, where did this come from?
Yeah. Well, and you may be unearthing some things. So your story has a lot of personal things going on.
Yeah.
And that's unearthed. So it's also possible this is stuff you're going through for you.
Yeah.
And I think whenever you're writing a story that either is memoir, obviously has that hugely, but also if you're writing stories that have a personal connection, and I work with a lot of people, and it's probably the most common thing is there's something in your own personal life that becomes the genesis for a story. So you're not telling your story, you're not doing a memoir, but there are a lot of things that are hitting pretty close to home. And, you know, there's a lot of talk that writing is therapy.
Yeah.
Right? We're all trying to sort out our own thing. I remember very distinctly being in a radio interview, which was a live interview. So I was already nervous because it's live. And so I'm anxious about the fact that it's live. And the person said, I noticed in all of your YA novels, the characters are struggling with issues of identity and trying to figure out who they really want to be. Is that something you've struggled with? And I had this moment where I almost started crying because I was like, apparently, yes. I didn't even know that was, I hadn't seen that connection. Like, it hadn't occurred to me until that interviewer said it. Like, and for a minute I was like, no, they're not at all. Like, these stories are so different. But fundamentally, to this day, everything that I have written is about a character finding their own way and trying to determine what kind of person they truly want to be. And I think maybe that's something that in my own life, I am still trying to figure out the difference between expectations, what people want you to be, what you feel you should be, versus maybe who you are, versus maybe feeling that you've somehow disappointed yourself. So for me, that was that awareness of like, okay, there's a lot going on in that. And that was something with me thinking, I'm not writing a personal story at all.
Yeah.
And for clarity, because this is recorded, I have never murdered anyone, nor have I wanted to. And there are no bodies in my basement.
Well, I was going to say, how does that relate to
but apparently,
Alice, right?
I do have some thoughts in that area that I need to sort out. So that would be my advice to you, as I would give yourself some free rein. If you feel like you're getting too far off track, set yourself a timer and say, for 20 minutes, I'm going to work on a scene, even if it's just bullet points, what that scene might look like, that is from my original outline or where I think I should be going. Okay. And once I've done that, then I can free to go back to playing and seeing what comes up and where it goes.
Right.
And that's totally fair. And sometimes that's just a way of sort of connecting in and remembering what was that original story that I wanted to tell. Because when you outlined it in a film perspective, there was something you were trying to achieve in that.
Yeah.
And it may even be interesting to go back and look at one of those earlier iterations and say, what was the point of this draft? Like, what was the point of the story in this draft? And then what is the point of the story? Like, I sometimes use the question, what is your story really about? So the book that I just finished and turned in for edits, you know, I could tell you the plot. So it's a remake of Strangers on the Train, and this girl gets involved in this murder thing. And that's what the book is about. If I was going to summarize it, that's what the back of the book blurb is going to say. But if you drilled me and said, you know, what is the book really about? It really is about, and with Malice had this as well, how far will you go if you're pushed? Like, is morality to some degree situational? Yeah. Like, you know, I'm not in certain situations, so I don't have to make certain calls. But if I was in a situation where someone was asking me to commit a murder, and if I didn't commit that murder, I had potential of going to jail, I had potential of losing friends and family, would I find a way to do it? And in fact, one of the characters talks about how the military trains people to kill other people, which is often their job, right? And so, you know, the character talks about, you know, when you look at someone across a foxhole, you're not thinking like, I wonder if that guy has a dog or if he likes to play the piano.
Right.
So I, you know, apparently have some issues. And then when I know what that is about, I can then go back and say, how do these scenes serve that deeper thing? And I wonder if in your case, what the book is really about, because I think the overall thing is still fairly consistent.
Mm-hmm.
This is a book about a guy dealing with his wife's death and
Mm-hmm.
his best friend coming back into town who's made major changes.
Mm-hmm.
Understatement. Major changes. And, what does that mean and how does that change our relationships? But I'm curious now, if you were to kind of start digging a little bit deeper, what is it really about? Is it about getting through grief? Is it about what does love really look like? Is it about how far we'll go to keep a secret, or are secrets dangerous? That may be an interesting thing to ponder on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think when I was doing the screenplay, to me it was the picture of love. What is that really about? I think now, so many years later, having experienced tremendous grief, then that has now become certainly more part of the story. But is it really about that? I would say no. I would say it to me, and this is where I'm sort of like, okay, it's seeming to me that he needs to realize that he's the glue that's held everything together. And he's always thought this other guy was the glue, or she was the glue, but he's the glue. And I want him to own that.
I think you need to write that down on a Post-it note and put it by your computer.
Yeah.
And then ask yourself, as you're writing scenes, does this show how he's the glue? Is this how he convinces himself he's not the glue? How does this particular scene relate to that thematic idea?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because that becomes to some degree, you could hang a story in all different sorts of ways, right? And
yeah,
you and I have talked about, another person who's writing a story has this great world building, like it's a very Jurassic Park world building.
yes.
And had a really great discussion with that individual around, in the nicest way possible, like, you're missing the point.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like, that's a fascinating world. It would also be fascinating if you took those same characters and you put them in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fascinating thing if you put those characters and put them on a spaceship that's going to collide with an asteroid. That's just the world that kind of shapes the decisions and things that are happening. So, Rose coming back to town, the fact that, these guys all live in this, that's your world that this story is happening within. But the story is the characters.
Yes, exactly.
And the choices they make. And that's why in our weekly newsletter, I sent out a link to Chuck Wendig's article on character agency. And if people didn't get that, I will put it in the notes for this office hours, because I think it's really good. So it's one of those terms people throw around all the time, like, does your character have agency? It's one of those writer terms that we like to say while sipping scotch and wearing leather patched elbows. And some people are like, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
And Chuck,
I don't.
Chuck does it really well because he's so very flip, like, he's amusing to me. But he talks about character agency is your character's ability to make a decision that then impacts and affects the story. They are more active than reactive. So it's a way of kind of digging in, and most people have probably heard the advice before. You can use coincidence to get your characters into trouble, but you can't use coincidence to get them out of trouble. They have to act on that. So a really good example using some YA books is just the Hunger Games. Mm-hmm. So fascinating world. Great inciting incident, right? The inciting incident is they pull, Katniss's sister's name out of the hat. She instantly knows what that means, but it's then her decision that drives the narrative forward.
Right.
Because she decides, no, I will take my sister's place. And that then takes the story in a particular direction. If she had decided, and let me be clear, I think for most people, the decision would have been like, oh, that's a really, yeah. Can I have your room when you're gone? It tells us a lot about her character that she made that choice. But you could see that there's two, like, at that point in the story, there was two different sections. Yeah. And that story would have been far less powerful if they'd pulled her sister's name from the hat, we had seen Katniss do like, oh, no, and then had someone say, oh, her sister's too young, take Katniss. And that person had made the decision to send her onto the Hunger Games. Then she's more of an observer.
Right.
So I tend to think about something happens. So A happens in your story, and your main character responds by doing something. That's the B, which then causes C to happen because of that decision, which then the main character has to respond to C. So they come up and do D, which then leads to E, so you're seeing that the character is sort of driving the narrative forward, which, to be clear, does not mean they are making good decisions.
Right. And that's just what I was going to ask. So, yeah, because I think sometimes to make no decision, though, isn't really an option. I mean, there's got to be some decision, even if it's a decision to walk away from something.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the age-old thing, and again, I come from a counseling background, so I tend to put on my therapist hat, is we would always tell people that no decision is a decision.
Yeah.
To choose not to act is a choice that you are making.
Yeah.
It's a passive choice. I would not want that to be the choice the character is always making.
Exactly.
But they will make some passive choices where they will choose not to become involved in something, or they will choose to shy away from a conflict. But that choice, like if I'm writing a book, a contemporary romance, and I have a man and a woman or two men, doesn't really matter to me, and they're having some communication issues, and the one person's like, I have to bring up this issue, like, I think they're cheating on me, and they choose not to, that has a consequence. By not bringing that up, that's going to change what happens in the story next.
Right.
Versus, I sometimes will see characters that seem to sort of just be drifting through the story. It's like they're on a boat. Chuck Wendig uses the example. They're on a boat on the river. They're just kind of along for the ride. So things are happening and they're like, oh my God. And then something else happens and oh my God. But they're not driving that boat. They're just along for the ride. And I think where you can see this oftentimes is, what is your character saying or doing when things happen? Or are they just thinking?
Okay.
That's one of the things that I look for, because you'll sometimes see, and I edit, obviously a lot of books where something will happen and then the character has this long period where they're thinking about what they thought about what happened. Versus I would rather see them, and there's no absolutes. It's not like every time they have to, but I would rather see them say something in that moment that the other person is then obviously going to have a reaction to, or to take an action in that moment that that person has a reaction to, because then that is moving the story forward.
Okay. I think, and I have certainly been guilty of it. I think I'm getting a little better at it. But I think when we have sort of learned, well, you want to have this character arc, you want to have this growth. And so, and I see that in a lot of the workshops with sort of newer writers. So then they think, okay, well, I want my character to end up strong. So they're going to start weak and passive. So they'll kind of flounder around like, a fish on the dock. And then eventually they jump into the sea and whatever. So I guess there's validity in terms of, okay, there's a story arc there, but is it a very interesting story?
That's one question. And it's also, I think, important to understand how people make change. Mm-hmm. So people don't change easily. Like, I think that's one of the things we don't like to admit. And certainly every magazine article is all like, how you can lose 20 pounds in a month and how you can, be more assertive and blah, blah, blah. Like, but people generally really struggle with change. So something happens to make someone change. And it's usually a push or a pull, right? So either something is so enticing, it's pulling them forward, or it's awful and they're like kind of running away from something else.
Yeah.
So in a character arc where we're saying, I want a character who's going from passive to finding their own strength, is one to understand that that's not a point A to point B. arc.
Yeah.
It's going to be like this.
Yes.
And it's very unlikely that someone who is totally passive is going to suddenly become totally reactionary.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Hunger Games, because I actually think that's sort of an interesting example.
Huh.
In the beginning of that, if we say like, what's Katniss's arc over that first book? And it's really about her becoming a revolutionary, right? And so in that beginning of that book, she cares about her and hers. She cares about her and her sister, really, is that very small, her mom to some degree, but even her mom's a little on that outside.
Yeah.
You know, but then we see her once she is, you know, involved in all this training, like she's starting to have moments where she's starting to care a little bit about what happens to other people. And we see her start to do a couple things to help someone out, even if later then she's mad at herself for doing it, because she, you know, she jumps in to sort of help the guy that she's partners with. Like she could have let him die. And in fact, in terms of the Hunger Games, that's not a bad idea. That's one more down, right? Like,
Exactly.
So the fact that she sort of helps him, and then she almost feels not bad about it, but I think she questions, like, why am I doing this to help him? And it's really not until we have this scene where I'm pretty sure the character's name is Rue, which is the young girl that dies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where that is the moment where she becomes a revolution. That's really her character arc, where we see that she is suddenly changing. And that is solidified and becomes rock solid in this very final climax scene where she and I can totally blanking on the poor guy's name.
I know, I am too.
That guy. You know, they've won. They beat Kato. I remember the bad guy's name. They beat Kato. You know, and they're kind of high-fiving each other, like, we won the Hunger Games, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, the sort of guy comes back on and says, okay, we've changed the rules, because they had said 2 people could win. Yeah. So we've changed the rules, and now it can't be that way. Yeah. And that is the real moment where I don't think anyone who read that book had any doubt that Katniss could have kicked his ass.
Yeah.
Oh, right? Yeah. She could have like been like, boop, and that would have been the end of that guy. Yeah. But that's where she takes it to the ultimate level of sacrifice, which was not her thing before. And she said, then we'll kill each other. Like, we'll each take these poison berries and we'll go out, because it is more noble to have this thing. So that is the final thing. But it's important to understand people will kind of go back and forth. And even someone who's passive is not totally passive. Or if they are, they're probably not a great character. But they're probably passive in maybe romantic relationships or certain other things. But there is something that they would stand up for. Yeah. And maybe use that in the beginning to get them into some trouble.
Right. Okay.
So for me, I really think spending time thinking about motivation, about why your character is doing what they do, is really useful to understanding that. And again, that's why I wanted to do my first masterclass on backstory, because I think it gets this kind of bad reputation, like, oh, backstory. But it's really important. And again, coming from a counseling perspective, I go back and I don't want to spend hours. I mean, I'm not a Freudian analyst. I'm not going to start with like, tell me about your mother. But there is no doubt in my mind that your relationship with your parents, those early attachments, have an impact on how you now act as an adult. Yeah. And I need to understand some of that. You know, if you're going through marital counseling, often one of the things that they start with is like, tell me about when you guys first met. What was going on? What attracted you to your spouse? I mean, that's all backstory, right? Because the real thing is whatever's going on now in the marriage. But we kind of need to have some understanding of that to figure out how to fix this other thing. So the challenge becomes, which is a great thing to eventually talk about, how much do you include? How do you include it? How do you know what it is? But too often my fear is that people start with their character. If this was a timeline and this is dot A, they start like page 1, and this is where my character is going to be by page 300. Right. And what they forget is, if this is page 1, there was a whole thing. I'll just scooch over. There's a whole thing that went this way before we got to page 1. Yeah. And the reader doesn't necessarily need to know all of those things, but they do need to know some of those things. And without any doubt in my mind, you need to know those things.
Yeah.
Because that informs you, kind of going full circle back to what you brought up, like, why is the character wanting to do this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And there are writers who talk about the characters talk to them. You know, my character tells me this. And I always think, you know, there's medication for that. But I think it's a very valid point. Like for some people, that really is how they get through the story. The character becomes this separate individual that they are cohabitating with. And their character is telling them, like, I don't want to do this thing. That's not what I would do.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to be that way. For me, I'm always aware they're my characters.
Yeah.
But if they are not, if I'm not wanting to write what I thought was the story, then at some fundamental subconscious level, something's not working.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go back into that, because then I can figure out what it is they'll do, and then how they will react, and how that will either be good, moving them closer to their goal, or for a lot of the book, be a bad decision, moving them further away from their goal.
Right. Yeah. Which can be very interesting too.
Oh yeah. Like, I mean, I think too often, again, a mistake that I see sometimes is that the character is moving like exactly like this through their arc. And they're just doing one great thing, and, you know, they get a little closer to their goal, you know, the next thing, and a little closer to their goal, and so forth. And that can work, but there is a real value in some of those side trips.
Yeah.
And there's some real value in getting lost and having to get back on the road. And I think taking that time with your character can be huge.
So it's not a waste. Good.
It is never a waste.
Okay.
If nothing else, you can always know, like when you publish your novel at someday and you do blog tours, people always say, do you have any missing chapters that weren't included in the book? And you're like, yes, I do.
Oh, yeah.
I have it all. But also sometimes I find, like, by doing that, you have a realization about a character. Like you realize, like, oh, they never got along with their mom. They never felt loved.
Yeah.
Oh, like that's why this is so important to them.
Yeah.
In the same way as, you know, again, when you're a counselor, sometimes your client will say something and you'll be like, oh, now I get it.
Yeah.
Now I understand what's going on. You see the world this way because of this thing.
Right.
And you have no idea that there's actually another way of seeing the world.
Yes.
There's a fascinating counseling theory that is actually really useful for writing as well. And there is no quiz on this, so don't worry. It's by a psychologist named Ellis, and it was called Rational Emotive Therapy, or RET. And what he talked about, and it's so easy to remember, it was the one that was the easiest on all the exams, is we called it the ABC theory. So A is the activating event. So that is what actually happens. So there is something, and that is actually a neutral thing.
Okay.
So that's A. B is your belief about that event.
Oh.
So that is the interpretation that you put on to that activating event.
Mm-hmm.
And C, the final piece, is the consequence of that belief.
Mm.
So, for example, you decide you want to take an art class.
Mm-hmm.
And you're really nervous because it feels like everybody else in the class is better than you, and you guys are all working on a thing, and you have to go to the bathroom. So you leave the room. When you come back into the room, everyone is laughing. And when they see you come into the room, they stop laughing.
Okay.
So that is the event. That is what has actually happened.
Okay.
What might be your belief about that event?
They were talking about me.
Yeah.
Right.
You can almost always count on women to answer that. You know, so, you know, a guy might be like, they just now realize it's time to get down to business. Like, there are actually other ways that could be interpreted. It could just be that that's just when the laughter happened to end.
Yeah.
It could be whatever. But if your belief is they were laughing at me,
Mm-hmm.
then there's a consequence to that. So it might be that you storm out.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you know, I don't need this. If you're going to laugh at me, I'm out of here. You go storming out of the room. And that consequence has now changed reality.
Yes.
Because whatever that activating event was, maybe they weren't laughing at you, but now they are. because it's like, what's with her?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Or, the consequence might be that you think, then I'm just not going to talk to anyone here. I'm just going to do my thing, and I'm just never going to interact with people. And then that changes the narrative story-wise, or that changes reality. Again, if we go back to it being a real counselor thing.
Yeah.
So if my belief is, because I have all sorts of issues, if I have poor self-confidence and someone says like, oh, nice shirt, and I think that they're kind of making fun, like, nice shirt, but that's not necessarily what they meant. And I suddenly, instead of thinking like, well, maybe they had a lousy day or they're just a bitch, I take it like I still can't dress myself appropriately. And I feel worse about myself, and I maybe engage in fewer social interactions, which further limits my world, which further depresses my mood, which further takes me down a narrative task.
Yeah.
So you can start to play with that. So ABC, or rational emotive therapy, is kind of an interesting thing to sort of say, what happens? What does someone say or do, or this person observes? What does my character believe about that? Yeah. And then, because you're God, which is a wonderful place to be for a period of time, you're God, you can decide, is that an accurate belief or not an accurate belief? What is the consequence of that belief? So going back to the initial example, you walk into the room, they're all laughing. Your belief is that they're laughing at you. The consequence is that you say, this is bullshit. This is supposed to be an art class. This is supposed to be about creativity. And everyone in here, you're a fake, because you don't actually care about art. You care about mocking others, and you storm out. Let's say your belief was right. They were laughing at you. The consequence is there may be someone in that room who suddenly has an epiphany of, wow, what I was doing was wrong. And again, if it was a story, then suddenly maybe that person follows after that other person. Maybe that story changes everything about that. So it becomes a really useful tool to sort of think about.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it is kind of nifty.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and it sort of makes me think about that wonderful book that you recommended, Eleanor Oliphant.
Oh, I was like, yes, whatever book that was.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that kind of takes that
to a ninth degree. So the title of the book again is, Christy?
Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman.
Thank you for remembering the author's name. I had forgotten it. I really like that book because the main character comes across as almost autistic. She makes some very interesting things, and she has some very interesting beliefs about why people do things. And then the way she acts then has some very distinct consequences. And she's a lovely example of a character who's not kick-ass heroine. I think sometimes when we think of character agency, we think they have to be Katniss, that they're, grabbing spears and flying into things, or, there's a character from Star Wars and they're doing this. Like Eleanor in that book, she does things, but she's not a heroine until much, much later. He grows into that, which I think is fascinating.
Oh, it's an amazing book. Yeah. Beautiful.
Thumbs up if people are looking for a good one. And I will list it again in the notes for the office hours so people can find. Any other questions for tonight?
I think that's all from me.
I think we are good then. So this was our second happy hours. So we will have happy hour next week, which is next Tuesday. But I'm in the morning that time. So if people are listening to this later, you are more than welcome to join us, which is the 23rd at 9 a.m. is my office hours. So I hope to see people then. We're actually going to be talking a little bit about memoir, because we have some questions ahead of time. And for everyone to know, if you ever do have questions, you can always put them in River. So all of us are checking River before our office hours. So if people have specific questions, you can't make office hours, but you're really hoping, gosh, I really hope that Crystal discuss what different kinds of ways you can use to self-publish a book. Like, I've heard of vellum. What is it? You can just fire that off to Crystal, and she will be happy to tackle that in her next office hours.
Right.
And for those of you who are here early in our early days of Creative Academy. This is a great time because, as you can see, tonight we had Christy here, so we can spend all night on Christy's issues if we want. So we have high hopes, possibly not Christy, but we have high hopes at some point that there will be like 10, 15 people here, so you may not get as much one-on-one, so take advantage of it while you can.
Thanks, Eileen. It was fantastic.
You're welcome. All right, everybody, have a good night, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.